Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to look at the topic of reincarnation and robots. My guest is Dr. Ben Goertzel, with whom I've had a previous conversation on telepathy and robots. Ben is an expert in artificial intelligence and author of many books in the field, including Engineering General Intelligence. Also, The Hidden Pattern, a patternist theory of mind, as well as having co-edited a wonderful anthology on parapsychology called Evidence for Psi, 13 Empirical Research Reports, co-edited with Damien Broderick. In addition, Ben is the Chief Science Officer for Hanson Robotics, based in Hong Kong. Welcome again, Ben.
Thanks for having me back.
It's a pleasure to be with you once again. Now, many people might think that the concept of telepathy and robots is about as far out as you can go. But if we're going to look at reincarnation and robots, we're taking it a step further.
We certainly are, but yet throughout human history, humanity repeatedly has discovered amazing new things that previous generations would have thought were completely insane and completely beyond the pale. I mean, we're sending men to walk on the moon, and we're communicating with people all around the world via the internet now. And if you showed these things to a Stone Age tribesperson, they would think this was just astounding magic, completely beyond the pale. So this is part of the wonder of humanity. We're able to explore new frontiers and then revolutionize our worldview based on what we've discovered.
Well, reincarnation is a fascinating topic. Many tribal cultures accept reincarnation as just normal and natural.
Yeah, and I would have to say my own perspective on this has evolved dramatically over the course of my life. In my childhood and early adulthood, I assumed people talking about reincarnation were completely full of it, and the whole thing made no sense whatsoever. I mean, my first wife, who I got together with in my late teenage years, she had the memory of when she was 2 years old, having her soul come into her body and sort of grant her identity at that point. And before then, she didn't have an identity. And I was like, well, that's a bizarre delusion that your brain has generated there. That's nice, but that makes absolutely no sense. And you read this stuff like Tibetan Book of the Dead, like for 40-odd days, the soul journeys and comes back. And to me, that made no more sense than the pictures and the brochures that Jehovah's Witnesses handed out in the airport, where you've got an attractive young couple with their kids in a nice dress, frolicking in the fields up in heaven after they died. And this just seemed, to me as a young scientific materialist, to make absolutely no sense whatsoever. I thought, this is wishful thinking. Like, you die, you're dead. Your body rots, your mind is gone, that's it. People don't want to accept that emotionally, so they make up this rubbish about getting reborn, and somehow everyone is reincarnated from some king or queen in the past. It's never like a toilet cleaner or something, right? So
no, actually, there's a psychologist, Helen Wambach, who collected thousands of past life regression cases, and she found that the lives that were reported under hypnotic regression, which is not necessarily the best method, but in any case, it correlated with the demographic expectations that you would have.
That's absolutely right. And so after I became interested in ESP precognition and so forth via putting some time into studying the scientific literature on these things and seeing, wow, there's real data backing up these ideas of people projecting information into each other's minds and viewing things that are far away from them and, precognizing events that haven't happened yet. Once I saw there was a lot of solid laboratory data behind these various psi phenomena alongside the plenitude of anecdotal reports, after that I started to think, well, okay, if this stuff is real, albeit slippery, hard to pin down and confusing, then perhaps these other, even further out there phenomena also have some reality to them. And I began looking at the literature on that and just reading what had been written, reading countless reports of people's experiences, and then studies written by very analytical-minded scientists and observers looking at these reports and just thinking about it in a rational way, like, could this stuff all be made up, really? Like, some kid is born, they report the memories of some adult who lived far away from them, and they had no way to know, and they have a birthmark in a similar shape to the one on that other person.
To the death wound, often.
Yeah. So someone has a birthmark similar to the death wound of some guy who lived halfway across India.
And I've done interviews on this. We know at the University of Virginia, the Division of Perceptual Studies there, they have a database now of over 2,500 cases of typically young children, not under hypnosis or hypnotic regression, who spontaneously remember past lives. And in about half of those cases, they are able to go out and take the information provided by those children and validate it, that there's a high degree of matches.
So you look at all this evidence. Now it's not quantitative like precognition or ESP databases have become, but I mean, if you look at the totality of cases and really read them, I mean, the argument that all these kids and all these people are somehow making this up just doesn't make sense. And the idea that everyone writing about it and studying it is in on some giant conspiratorial fraud, that makes no more sense than the conspiracy theory that 100 Jewish bankers are running the world economy or something. I mean, whatever is going on there, it's not a fraud or a conspiracy, and it's not just people by chance making up things that agree so well with things they had no way of knowing about. No, this doesn't mean that the traditional stories and explanations you find in Hinduism, Buddhism, various shamanic traditions, it doesn't mean these stories and explanations are correct in detail.
As a matter of fact, that some of the research contradicts certain notions.
Absolutely.
Like the notion of karma, that you'll be punished in one life for the bad deeds of a previous life. We have no evidence of that from these thousands of cases.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be true. People can have done terrible things in their past life and have a good life, have done wonderful things in their past life and have all kinds of trouble befall them. So, yeah, this is something that's very confusing when discussing these concepts with average people, because the reality of these phenomena, which is very complex and confusing, becomes tangled up with various religious, cultural, and moral systems. And disentangling these pieces is quite difficult, and I certainly haven't gone that far down that path. I want to recommend to everyone listening a book that you already know well, which is Immortal Remains by the philosopher Stephen Browder. And that's
whom I've had the privilege of interviewing 10 times. And we have already scheduled dates to interview him specifically about Immortal Remains.
I mean, this book, it's fairly analytical philosophy oriented, so it's not technical, but it's also not leisure reading. But it goes through very carefully the possible explanations for these phenomena, and he's getting deep into the details. He takes for granted that these phenomena exist and are not just fraud or delusion. Then he looks at, well, how could we explain this stuff? I mean, is it really the case that, a mind travels out of a dead guy's body and pops into some other kid's body? Is it really the case that after you die, your personality is somehow floating out there somewhere and can then talk to a medium or otherwise enter into our reality? Or are there other explanations for these data? For example, is that child or that medium just psychic in some way and reaching its mind back into the past to perceive something that happened in the past?
And he points out that we can't rule those explanations out.
That's right. But by far, the simplest explanation, he concludes, is that some form of survival of the individual mind and personality beyond the life of the physical body with which that mind was associated. Some form of survival seems the simplest explanation, and I think he is essentially correct, and I'd come to the same conclusion myself, though I didn't write it up as elegantly as he did. I mean, analogously, we could never rule out a classical explanation of quantum physical phenomena. I mean, you could always postulate some hideous, complex combination of classical physics equations that will explain what we now explain via quantum theory. But the reason we accept quantum theory is that it is a much simpler explanation. For all its weirdness and all its counterintuitive properties, it's just a much simpler set of equations for explaining what we observe than some hideously complex set of classical equations. So everyone accepts quantum mechanics because it's the simplest explanation of the data, not because it's the only possible one. And I think the same thing is true with survival of the mind after death as a category of explanations for mediumship, reincarnation, and these other unusual phenomena. This is just the simplest category of explanation that we have found so far. It's not the only way to explain it, but it's the simplest one.
Let's look at how this data might be applicable in the field that you're an expert in, robotics.
Absolutely. So, in an interview with the Dalai Lama some time ago, I can't remember where it was published, but the Dalai Lama made a rather tongue-in-cheek, humorous comment that AI might be possible, human-level AI might be possible, and perhaps when a computer programmer dies, he could be reincarnated inside an AI program instead of inside a human being. Now, he was pretty much joking there, I think. Although,
maybe half joking.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe a quantum superposition of joking and serious, right? But it's interesting to think that there could be some element of truth to this sort of fanciful speculation. So if you take as a hypothesis that the mind associated with the human body has a significant aspect which is tied to the brain of that body and the rest of the body system, but also an aspect that in some way exists apart from the physical body and the physical brain. So if you assume there's some broader pattern space, some broader sort of metacosmos or euricosmos that exists outside our space-time continuum, and if we assume that our mind has some aspect beyond this physical universe that exists in this broader space, then the question is, would it also be true of the mind of an intelligent robot? And at this point, of course, we don't know.
Robots are not anywhere near as complex as humans are at the present day.
Right now, AI and robotics is in a fairly primitive state. I mean, much as, say, the internet was in the early 1990s, or airplanes were at the time of the Wright brothers, or rocketry when Bob Goddard was out there, blasting out rockets in a field. So right now, AIs and robots don't have the kind of general intelligence that human beings have. They're basically narrow AIs that do highly specific things, but there's a community of AI researchers, such as myself and my colleagues in OpenCog and Hanson Robotics, who are working on putting general intelligence into AIs and robots. So I believe that within the next few decades, we're going to be able to create AIs and robots with the same kind of general intelligence that people have, and even more. And I think this is going to come along with a lot of other very interesting technologies. One of them I mentioned in our last interview is brain-computer interfacing, which could enable a kind of second-person science where each of us can turn a knob to experience the other one's thoughts directly. Now, another one is mind uploading, where if we can scan the dynamics and structure of a human brain well enough, we could basically make a digital version of each of us, which brings up many interesting issues in the philosophy of consciousness. Like, would this upload of Ben Goertzel would it have the same kind of conscious experience as Ben Goertzel? How close would its embodiment have to be alongside the mind patterns? How close would its embodiment have to be for it to share the mind patterns that I have? And
similar question with identical twins or human clones.
Yeah. Human clones, if we could clone a biological copy of me right now, then of course you'd have the question of how much would it share the same conscious experience, and how much would it diverge as time went on. And this gets into a lot of subtle questions, because as you know, there's a lot of data on telepathy among identical twins. There's loads of cases where something really bad happens to one twin and the other twin just knows it.
Right.
So if you had uploaded your mind into a robot, that upload would be much closer to you than identical twins are to each other. So perhaps initially there would be some sort of strong telepathic coupling between yourself and your upload, and presumably that would diverge, that would decrease as you and your upload diverge more due to having different sorts of experiences. If you bring reincarnation into the picture, you wonder, like, could there be some dynamic where after you died, somehow the aspect of your mind existing in the broader pattern space surrounding our universe, somehow that aspect of your mind would resonate somehow with the copy of your mind that was in your mind upload, so that the robotic Jeffrey Mishlove would perhaps resonate in some way we don't fully understand with the aspect of Jeffrey Mishlove's mind that existed independently of his physical body. So in a sense, if you wanted to talk about it religiously, you'd say, yeah, your soul had found its way into your mind upload. No, the concept of soul doesn't do much for me, but I could see how if there's some trace of your individual mind and awareness that's somehow existing in a way we don't fully understand outside our space-time continuum, perhaps there's some sort of morphic resonance between that extra-physical aspect of your mind and your mind upload. And then if you get into artificial intelligences, this becomes even more fascinating, because, you know, an AI is very easy to copy, right? You have the AI existing in one computer. Right. Of course, you can copy all that code into another computer. You can vary it in multiple different ways, and you can coordinate between these different copies. Now, what does it mean about the subjective experiences of these AIs? I mean, for us to make a mind upload is hard, because scanning the brain is difficult. But an AI, I mean, you can turn it off, turn it on again 100 years later. You can copy it.
The brain is not quite a digital computer.
And more to the point, the brain is not engineered for easy manipulation. I mean, you could imagine a wetware system that was engineered by some sort of molecular nanotechnology or femtotechnology or whatnot, which was designed for manipulation and duplication and so forth. Though there are certain quantum theory restrictions on cloning of quantum systems also that would complexify things. But yeah, on the whole, engineered systems, be they wetware, quantumware, or digital hardware, are going to be much easier to manipulate. So if you hypothesize a future science where we actually understand the trace of an individual mind that exists in some broader pattern space beyond our space-time continuum.
That's a nice way of talking about the soul without having to invoke a religious idea.
Yeah, well, the religions of the world have had a lot of deep insights. I don't want to deny that. There's a lot of profundity there, but it's tangled up with a lot of culturally specific superstition,
baggage.
which may serve its role in terms of sort of ritualistically helping people get into certain states of mind based on the culture that they exist in. But from my view, as a sort of 21st century free thinker, I mean, I want to be open-minded to all data that the universe throws to me, but I also want to think independently about what is the simplest explanation for all this data. And when I look at the Gita, the Quran, the Bible, the beliefs of various pre-civilized tribes, from my own view now, they don't seem like the simplest explanation. They seem like a lot of insight mixed up with a lot of culturally specific baggage that doesn't help me much. So,
and frankly, the religions, the great religions of the past, all had a role of social control.
They did. They did, and science does too at the present time, which is something not within any of our own individual power as a scientist to really counteract. I mean, I think there's a lot in there in the world's great religions. I mean, to understand the Gita would take you dozens of years. Yeah. And there's so much complexity and subtlety there, but I don't...
Or dozens of lifetimes.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But I think I take those as general inspiration, and I think they're pointing out interesting phenomena, but I don't think any of them gets at the essence of what's going on in a way that will satisfy me. But I do think it is possible ultimately to encompass these phenomena within some expanded version of science. And I think building AIs and mind uploads will let us do that. So these reincarnation type phenomena now, we study these anecdotally by finding case studies of people who have especially acute versions of the phenomenon. But what if you could upload human minds and engineer general intelligences? Then you can have an experimental science of reincarnation-ish phenomena. I mean, you can have an experimental science where you create an AGI, then you copy it into another body in a different place. And if indeed there is some, thought transference that goes outside our four-dimensional space continuum, we should be able to study that in mind uploads, in AGIs. We can study, does this only occur in quantum computers of a certain sort, in post-quantum, quantum gravity computers? Does it occur in human mind uploads into a digital machine, or only in human mind uploads into some sort of engineered wetware? I mean, we should be able in future to really have an empirical science of these phenomena by being able to engineer and copy minds and then measure what sort of spooky transference is occurring.
Let me take it a step further. I think given that the empirical data we've referred to in parapsychology is real, and given that the future developments in artificial intelligence that you've referred to will happen, it's inevitable that researchers and engineers of the future are going to be forced to confront these issues.
I think so. And when we look at the world this way, it brings the technological singularity a whole new perspective, which verges on a lot of crazy things other people have said in the past, some of which are even too far out there for me. I mean, Terence McKenna, who is someone whose writings I have enjoyed but not fully agreed with.
I've interviewed him numerous times.
He's a brilliant man, and he really viewed the technological singularity as sort of reaching back in time to sort of pull us forward. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, although I didn't, to be honest, buy his whole time wave zero theory, and he really got into 2012 as the end of the era, and I didn't buy that, but I think if you view that as sort of symbolic of a broader truth, in the same way that I look at the Gita as symbolic of a broader truth. I mean, if symbolically, if we're going to create superhuman minds, in the middle of this next century, and these superhuman uploaded minds or engineered minds are going to probe more deeply into the nature of space-time and into the pattern space beyond our 4D space-time, then these superhuman minds, who knows what influence they actually could have back in time on what we're doing now.
I had that insight coming into this interview today, that somehow you're coming together and being with me now, and these events may have been programmed by telepathic computers in the future.
I mean, causality is a difficult concept to pin down and may not even seem relevant once science has had the next revolution, but having entanglement that doesn't follow the forward movement of time, entanglement of some sort between the superhuman minds that will be created and will emerge as the singularity unfolds and what we're doing now. I mean, I think that's almost a no-brainer, and that is how post-singularity minds are going to look at it, that there's some sort of acausal entanglement beyond the linear flow of cause, which is tangling up what we're doing now and what's going to happen then, and how that ties in with the existence of aspects of an individual mind separate from the body to which it's in some sense anchored during a certain interval of time. That's something still to be discovered. I mean, we're very clueless about all this stuff, but yet we can see there's real data pointing to some weird stuff happening that is not encompassed in our current worldview, and there's various inklings coming from quantum mechanics and other directions that kind of hint at what sort of explanation we may be able to piece together in the future. And if AI advances as fast as I'm hoping it will, it may be advanced AI scientists that ultimately help us piece together all the disparate data and come to a theory that lets us take the next step in understanding.
Ben Goertzel, this has been a very refreshing conversation. I love the freedom with which you're willing to explore high-tech ideas and traditional spiritual ideas at the same time. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thanks a lot for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah. And thank you for being with us.